Good evening, comrades, and welcome back to Why Marx. Again, Tina is enjoying a well-earned break. This week we have, in part of our series on the development of a communist party, we have Lawrence Parker from Talking About Socialism, speaking in a personal capacity, and Jack Conrad of the Provisional Central Committee of the Communist Party of Great Britain. They'll be talking about the history of the Communist Party of Great Britain, founded in 1920. So, without further ado, Lawrence, over to you.
Hey, thank you very much, Ian, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm grateful for that. Um, I did circulate an article to go with this talk, but it might have been slightly misleading in that I suppose that article probably more speaks to a debate that I'm having with Mike McNair in a few weeks' time, but some of it will be relevant. So we're here to talk about the old CPGB, the official CPGB that was founded in 1920. Um, and this talk, I'm really solely focusing on the foundation of the CPGB and the various splits and fusions and preceding organizations that went to make it. And like all these kind of talks, until you clear away a kind of whole heap of myths and preconceptions, you can't really understand very much about it. And so the point of this talk is not to give you a big heap of facts that you can get from most books. I am going to talk about some facts, obviously, because that's kind of inevitable. But I'm going to try and encourage you to have your own thoughts on the topic and to develop your own kind of critical understanding. Because often the things you're told about the early CPGB, particularly by various far left organisations and sects, it is most very often it's wrong, misconceived, and it's been put together for kind of very instrumental reasons, whatever their theory is about it. So hopefully I can clear away a few of those kind of myths, and so hopefully think about this topic a little bit afresh. Um, so I'm going to begin by looking at a CPG journal called The Communist, which was their first paper. And in the aftermath of the CPGB's kind of founding or fusion congress in August 1920, the leading figures of the various groups that had come together to form the CPGB, and most of the people involved in these particular articles in the Communists were members of the kind of the biggest organisations that were involved in the fusion of the CPGB, the British Socialist Party, which is called BSP, and also the Communist Unity Group, which was a split from the De-Leonist Socialist Labour Party. They'd actually split the comrades in the Communist Unity Group had split away from what was the SLP because of its sectarian attitude to the fusion negotiations around the early CPGB. But these comrades gave their impressions to the Communist Journal, and there was a big article which was really quite long articles actually saying what these comrades thought about what they'd done and what they'd achieved and how the Congress had kind of gone. Uh, Now, it's fair to say the early kind of this founding Congress of the CPGB, there was a controversial debate and a very, very close vote on the issue, the main issue that kind of was the issue of controversy at the founding Congress, whether the CPGB should affiliate to the Labour Party. And the vote in favour of affiliation was a close vote, but that was in favour. And so there were some losers on this side, which was the communist, particularly the Communist Unity Group comrades. They'd lost the debate and they'd lost the vote. So there was some recognition from them as losers that they'd really would rather have preferred that the debate had gone the other way and that the CPGB the early CPGB hadn't have voted to affiliate to the Labour Party. However, despite all of this, and despite also the BSP comrades, the British Socialist Party comrades, who most of them had won that debate, obviously they were making consoling noises and saying, kind of bad luck and but the thing that came out over and above all of this type of stuff was the actual comrades' sense of pride and their sense of achievement in what they'd actually done, in that they'd had this vote, an important vote over an important tactic, but people hadn't split away. People had stayed within the CPGB. They'd accepted their kind of loss. And as I say, there was a great deal of pride and achievement, and this is a sense of purpose. And there was this in the articles, there's this kind of pervading feeling about we've been over this long labyrinthine and complex kind of process of splits and fusions. But here we are, we've kind of come together and we formed the CPGB, and we're proud of that kind of fact. That's the feeling you get from those kind of articles if you read that if you read the early issues of the Communist. Similar impression comes across when CPGB members talked about and reported upon the second fusion congress of this early CPGB in January 1921, when Sylvia Pankhurst's group, which she'd called Communist Party, British section of the Third International, and others also came into the young CPGB. Again, the response, the kind of the overwhelming response was of pride and a sense of achievement that we've achieved our goal of a united CPGB. And this pride, this feeling of pride and this feeling of achievement persisted in the CPGB through to when it celebrated its 20th anniversary of the party in 1940. There are some contingent factors about why they'd probably celebrated the foundation of the CPGB at that point in 1940, but I don't have time to go into that. It's too complex. Uh, but many leading party foundation members, including Albert Inkpin, who'd actually been removed as General Secretary in 1929, they wrote in the party press in 1940 about their sense, and William Gallagher also, about their sense of pride, looking back at what they'd done, that they'd overcome this situation where they'd been divided into various small groups and factions, and they'd overcome that to form the CPGB, which they were still very proud of at that point. And the articles by Inkpin, Gallagher, and other kind of foundation members of the Communist Party, they were accompanied in the 1940 period by a number of kind of memoirs from this kind of period. So you had a book by Tom Bell, he'd been a member of the BSP and the SLP before joining the CPGB. He wrote a book called Pioneering Days. There was also Harry Pollitt's Important Serving My Time, which appeared in 1940 because Pollitt had obviously been removed from the CPG leadership at the start of the Second World War due to his opposition to the Comintern's anti-war line. So he had a bit of time on his hands, and he wrote a memoir, which the early part of which is very interesting and a very important book. There was also books that appeared later on by founder members that are important as well. Tommy Jackson wrote a book called Solo Trumpet. That was a bit later in 1953. But all of these, the single factor that unites these kind of books is that they all looked back, and it was actually, in some ways, it's kind of quite odd because in some ways there's a kind of wistful tone in a lot of Harry Pollitt's writings about the early CPGB and this foundation period, some of which kind of half suggests that he found that a more edifying period than the period he was actually in 1940 when he'd been removed from the leadership. And this was kind of big news in bourgeois society. And it was fairly humiliating, although they made sure that no one claimed his mantle and he was able to reclaim the leadership when the war line changed. But that's another kind of story. So this sense of achievement kind of persists until about 1940. And also, what's interesting about Pollitt serving my time is that book also contains an appreciation of Sylvia Pankhurst and his work with Sylvia Pankhurst in London. Now, given that Sylvia Pankhurst had taken her group and walked out of the CPGB in around 1922, I think, over a squabble about control over publications and Pankhurst's differences with the CPGB over the Soviet Union. Pollitt's actual dedication to her in that book is actually very out of step with Comintern polemics of that period, where you get obviously where they trended the Stalinized Comintern, if we can call it that, treated renegades in a more vitriolic kind of way. Pollitt actually wrote very kind of movingly and about what a great activist and a great person Pankhurst was. But so this sense of achievement persisted, but very, very little of this sense survived onto the far left into the 1960s and 1970s. And you don't really hear, apart from me and Jack maybe, and a few other people, you still won't hear an awful lot of positive kind of rhetoric about the early CPGB. We hopefully we won't be in a minority on that for much longer. But it's still, this is all seen as the early CPGB is still seen as something that's problematic. Where that began was actually in the CPGB itself in the 60s and 70s. The CPGB had what could be called a house kind of historian, James Klugman, who wrote quite a number of well-known books on the early CPGB. And he established a method on the basis that the CPGB as an organisation had been drifting to had been, well, not drifting, had been lurching to the right for a long period. And it had a programme, the British Road to Socialism, that was the kind of antithesis of the early CPGB. The early CPG was in favour of revolution and was not in favour of a parliamentary road to socialism. By 1950, the CPGB was in favour of that. So therefore, it looked with the later CPGB of the post-war era began to look on the early CPGB with a slight air of embarrassment. And the method that it kind of established was basically to damn the early CPGB with kind of faint praise, really, and to say that the groups that founded it were mostly composed of sectarian propagandists. And but if we do have to pick the group that we think is most amenable to us, we quite like the British Socialist Party, the BSP, because that one is not exactly close to us, but it's the one we share kind of our politics today share most with. So it was so you get this method of like slightly condescending attitude to the early CPGB, plus this attempt to actually pick one of those organizations out and kind of elevated it over and above the actual unity process that happened. This is actually how that they began to treat it. And also the CPGB from the 60s and 70s and certainly into the 80s, it began to have this idea that the real foundation point of the CPGB wasn't the unity process that its early members were so proud about and the achievement of that. The real foundation point of the CPGB was the Popular Front of the 1930s, when the party began to get slightly less unpopular and it began to swim with the tide of kind of bourgeois progressive opinion and the opinion in the labour movement that began to look upon the Soviet Union as a potential bulwark for peace and against fascism in the 1930s. This was the real foundation period of the CPGB. So this is what actually happened to that kind of line. This method was actually then picked up by and shared with the various Trotskyist groups, the bigger Trotskyist groups, who also began to write about the early CPGB in the 1960s and 70s. And the method that Klugman and the CPGB had kind of established was absolutely perfect for the main Trotskyist sects. So if we think about them, unlike the early CPGB, of course, which had a big tactical difference, argued that tactical difference, reported on it openly, and then founded a united organisation based on the fact that the people who'd lost the vote on the Labour Party didn't walk. Unlike the early CPG and like this, the two biggest organisations on the Trotskyist left in Britain, the SWP and Militant, precisely they stayed in separate organisations, ostensibly because of a tactical difference over whether to work in the Labour Party or not. They stayed divided on this issue. So you can see that straight away that the early CPGB presents a problem. And given that the early CPGB was, of course, the party of Lenin and Trotsky, it was the party that they, with all its flaws, it was the party that the leaders of the Communist International, supported and wanted to succeed. So this presents an enormous problem to kind of the bigger Trotskyist groups of this period. So to actually trumpet the early CPGB offers them a kind of problem. So they tended to pick up on the method of the early CPGB instead of instead of emphasizing this project of unity. What you actually get in most Trotskyist accounts is an attempt to pick out usually either the British Socialist Party or the Communist Unity Group or the SLP, the Socialist Labour Party. No, these are the real Bolsheviks. The other ones were just kind of ones who just attached themselves to it. So you get this sense again that one or other of the fusion organization is being elevated over the unity process itself to suit modern day, what the Trotskyists need in the modern day to justify their own existence as separate organizations. So, and then if you came from the SWP tradition, therefore, and there's an awful book by Raymond Challoner called The Origins of British Bolshevism, which is possibly the worst book you can read on the early CPGB, in my opinion. If you're from the SWP tradition, well, of course, you don't really like the British Socialist Party that was affiliated to the Labour Party from 1916, because that doesn't match up with what you are. Instead, you trumpet the Socialist Labour Party, the and its with all of its fetishes about workplace organisation, because you think that one's the one closest to you. Similarly, when the militant did write about the old CPGB, when they were in the Labour Party in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they, of course, preferred the British Socialist Party, with some reservations, I have to say. But of course, they preferred the British Socialist Party because it had had a longer tradition of affiliation to the Labour Party, and because it was the organisation that, when the CPGB was first formed, it was mostly the comrades from the British Socialist Party, comrades like Joe Vaughan, who was the first communist mayor in Britain in Bethnal Green in the early 20s. These were the figures who kind of led the CPGB's work inside the Labour Party. So obviously the militant saw that as best matching up with what they were, and so they tended to overemphasize that and poo-poo the Socialist Labour Party side. So it really is that simple, and you can tell what tradition Trotsky has come from as soon as they start arguing about the CPGB. I can tell within seconds. So, but like I say, this was a copy of what the old CPGB had done, and yeah, and it wasn't a very edifying method. But this is really why no one really wants to talk. No one wants to talk overly positively about the early CPGB. If you're from any of these kind of traditions, it becomes possible. And actually, the history of the early CPGB completely disappears from all of this. actually, you get no sense of what I've taught you about of their actual sense of achievement and what they'd actually done and what they were actually trying to achieve in 1920. It all disappears. Uh, Instead, you get a game of pick and mix where you pick this one, you take this bit, don't like that bit, all that type of stuff. Having said all this, none of the groups that came together to form the CPGB were anyway perfect. So it really is a silly game to prefer one over the other. The British Socialist Party, for example, had begun the war with a chauvinist leadership, the First World War with a chauvinist leadership of Henry Hyman, and had taken Henry Hyman's traditional anti-German chauvinism to ridiculous levels. So in the early part of the war, you'd find articles in Justice, which was the British Socialist Party paper, supporting the recruitment for the war. But this happened on the other side as well in terms of the Socialist Labour Party. They had a vile line at the beginning of the First World War. The editor of their paper, the socialist John Muir, I think it was, he was an advocate of the kind of myth of the First World War, the British imperialism used to justify its entry, i.e., poor little Belgium having its neutrality violated. This was the actual line of some of the early socialist articles. But in general, the SLP downplayed its opposition to the war because it saw it as a diversion from the workplace kind of struggle. So also Pankhurst was an opponent. Sylvia Pankhurst was an opponent of the war, but she in East London, she downplayed her opposition to the war in the early stages. The BSP, of course, it did get rid of its chauvinist leadership in 1916, and it evolved to what I would kind of judge would be a kind of pacifist position on the war. And of course, all these groups and individuals were buoyed by the impact of the Russian Revolution and the industrial struggles that took place in Britain as the war developed. But what I'm trying to illustrate is that all these groups had huge warts and we're a very long distance from kind of Bolshevik kind of politics on the war of, I don't know, the main enemy is at home or turn the imperialist war into a civil war. That wasn't on these groups' agendas. However, these groups were on a journey, and that journey was mostly positive. The BSP had begun to deal with some of its sectarianism. Uh, uh, the BSP anti-war comrades also kicked out their chauvinist leadership in 1916 and produced a new paper called The Call, which was much better than whatever Justice had been during the war. And the SLP also, sections of the SLP had begun to realize that their leadership was completely sectarian and that if they actually wanted to get together and form a proper communist party, they'd have to break with it. So what you're talking about, which I'm having to sum this up very quickly, is a whole set of groups which weren't perfect, which we can't idolize and we can't make a fetish of any of these kind of groups. But they were going on a journey in an era of war and revolution. And these groups, you could say, were being imperfectly forged in an era of war and revolution. And so therefore, they were going on a real journey, and their journey was a positive one because they came together to form the CPGB and they broke with their earlier practices. So right, I'm just going to how long have I got left? 5 minutes. Okay. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is just very quickly is about the international dimension of the CPGB as well. Uh, Cold War kind of pro-Labour historians, who I'd have to count Walter Kendall, the Trotskyist author, in, they looked at it through the wrong end of the telescope of basically of a CPGB that had been dominated and moulded by Moscow for about 50 years when they were writing. All they could see, which I think is kind of a patriotic reflex, which they've inherited from the Labour Party, was the negative effects of the early Russian influence on the CPGB. And to this, we'd have to respond that it is It's probably unlikely that the CPG would have been founded without the promptings and interest of Lenin and the Comintern. It's possible that it may not have happened. They were very important actors. But of course, Walter Kendall thought it better that not to have founded the CPGB, and his argument is that the BSP, the British Socialist Party, which was his favourite organisation, he leave it to his own British national kind of development, which is a kind of a patriotic kind of Cold War emphasis, really. And we'd have to say, really, that it's actually, I think, when you actually look back on the early Russian involvement in the CPGB, I don't think that this would have been considered in any way weird or strange. And it's actually touching to look at the amount of time that Lenin spent on the British movement and meeting up with comrades like Willie Gallagher and Sylvia Pankhurst to get them on board, and the time he spent polemicizing, writing about it, and thinking about it and encouraging them. Lenin, of course, did know the British socialist movement very well. You can read a 1913 obituary of Harry Quelch, who was an SDF, a member of Hyman's SDF and subsequently the British Socialist Party, who Lenin knew well and he'd worked with him. There's nothing also in the memoirs of Gallagher, Pankhurst, and others that he treated them with anything less than respect. This is not like the later kind of Comintern or Russian leadership laying down the kind of law. He was treating them as comrades because he wanted them in the CPGB and he wanted them in the Comintern. Now, Lenin wasn't being soft on them. He was trying to win them. He was trying to win them to his particular line and a particular line and his particular ideas. Similarly, when British communists first received copies of Lenin's left wing communism, which we kind of now know as a better translation of children's sickness or growing pains of the communist movement. When the British comrades first received this and started to review it in the pages of the Communist, William McLean and others, they did not treat Lenin as some kind of living saint, or they didn't treat him as he was later canonized in under Leninism. They treated Lenin as somebody who was an extremely insightful person on the issue of tactics and someone they treated with respect because he'd led the Russian Revolution. And the British Socialist Party comrades also liked Lenin and liked Lenin's kind of left-wing communism because Lenin had their ear because he was arguing and articulating their politics in the early CPGB. And so therefore there's nothing you begin to get the picture of something that's not sinister as the way that Cold War historians kind of paint this. Russian emigres had worked in the British movement for a long time. Important emigres like Theodore Rothstein, Maxim Litvinov, they'd long played a positive role in the British movement and breaking the British socialist organisations away from chauvinism. Similarly, if we look at the question of finance, it's undoubtedly true, and you can read this in Kevin Morgan's book, Labour Legends and Russian Gold, that the early Comintern provided the CPGB with a lot of finance and a lot of cash and a lot of physical kind of support in that way. However, I don't think this would have been seen strange or sinister or weird. Because, on the other hand, when the Bolsheviks took power, one of the early things that the Russian government actually did was to pay back loans that had been given to the RSDLP by British socialist organisations such as the BSP and the SLP, and they were, these comrades were amazed to find this. So it wouldn't have been seen very strange or weird at the kind of time. And I think comrades who have a problem with this idea of Russian involvement and Russian finance, I really think they expose themselves as patriots, really, British patriots, really. And what they're actually doing, although they probably don't know it, is they're reflecting this was the gripe that the Labour Party had for years against the Communist Party of Great Britain, that it was a Russian finance, Russian influenced organisation that wouldn't, like the British Labour Party, ever do the bidding of British imperialism. And that was the Labour Party's gripe with it. So I think we have to recast the positive international influence on it. It's true, of course, that in the end, by the 1930s, the Soviet Union wasn't a positive influence on the CPGB. But this is looking through the wrong end of the kind of telescope at the early CPGB. And I've done half an hour there, so I'm going to shut up and bring that to a close. Thanks, Ian.
Parker, thank you. That was an excellent introduction, fascinating, and I look forward to hearing much more about that. Jack, over to you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lawrence. Useful introduction and very useful for me too, because it gives me a springboard. I've done quite a bit of reading, true, a long time ago, of the communist, the call, justice, workers' dreadnought, very good paper. So I'm sort of familiar with the background. I'm familiar, as we can be, with the writers, the individuals concerned. What I would emphasize here is how should I put it, the thunderclap, the impact of both Russian revolutions, both February and October. I think that did radically change things. Now, that didn't mean that things were static in Britain. Lawrence has already referred to the BSP and how at their Easter conference in 1916, they voted to affiliate to the Labour Party, but they also took an anti-war position. My understanding, Lawrence, and I suspect you're better read than I am, was that Hyman wasn't kicked out. He walked, and he formed, from our point of view now, rather unfortunately named National Socialist Party. Also, I'd just like to emphasize another thing, which I certainly found inspirational in terms of my political career, is that the vote in Easter 1916 to take a anti-war position was something that was long fought for. Again, I don't know, Lawrence. You most likely know the dates better, but the call wasn't founded in 1916 with the victory of one side. This was founded as an unofficial paper that fought the chauvinism of Heinemann and Justice, and won after a 2-year struggle. Worthwhile pointing out, by the way, that I suppose, like with a lot of social imperialist publications, it had quite a weird view of the world. I can't remember whether it went on about poor little Belgium, but I certainly know with Henry Hyman, the leader of the BSP, is he talked about his comrades in Germany, and no surprise, the comrades were Liebknecht and Luxembourg. These are the people that he looked at, because they too were against Germany, Prussian militarism. So he was full of enthusiasm for them. But yes, he thought that a victory for Britain, that would be a victory for civilization. And of course, what was embarrassing for such comrades was the fact that their imperialism was allied to Tsarism. That was something that they had a lot of difficulty in explaining. Yeah, I liked Lawrence's take on Lenin. I've read my Willie Gallagher, when he traveled to Moscow, I think with Sylvia Pankhurst, over waters. I think it was Var, Norway. Either way, I can remember the description of their discussions with Lenin, but I can also remember, and this sort of reinforces what Lawrence was saying, I can remember reading the accounts of the first Congress over that weekend, July the 31st to August the 1st. And in particular, what struck me in terms of the vote was its narrowness, because, yes, you had Lenin banging away about overcoming sectarianism, using all tactics. There was an overwhelming vote to participate in parliamentary elections. This was something that Sylvia Pankhurst had objected to and kept her out of the founding Congress. But when it came to the debate, some of them were quoting Lenin, but also what I was struck by is BSP comrades saying that the Labour Party corrupted, and you had them getting up and say, I should know because I'm a member. And so this wasn't just a defeat, in terms of this narrow vote for the former comrades of the Socialist Labour Party, the Communist Unity Group. This was a defeat for quite a sizable slice of the BSP that wasn't persuaded by Lenin, but had been persuaded by their first-hand experience of actually being in the Labour Party and sometimes actually being Labour Party councillors and the like. Again, small point, I again might be wrong here, and I'm not claiming anything big here. My understanding with Sylvia Pankhurst is she kept out, and it was her comrades that joined at the second Congress, and she didn't. And I think there was a dispute between her and her comrades about the ownership of Workers' Dreadnought, and I think she insisted on keeping ownership for herself. But I can echo what Lawrence said about Pankhurst. She was a tireless fighter. She was one of the comrades, along with Harry Pollitt, that was responsible for the Jolly George winning the working class in Britain to threaten a general strike if this boat was, how should I put it, loaded with British munitions in order to go to Poland. And I can also add that having read, the Socialist, the Communist Unity Group, the Core, Justice, that the best written paper on the left at the time, I don't agree with the political line, but the best written paper, in my humble opinion, was the Workers' Dreadnought, not least the articles by Sylvia Pankhurst. She was an outstanding journalist as well as an activist. Again, just sort of reinforcing, this isn't a double act, by the way, but reinforcing what Lawrence was saying. I need to take you back to the days way before the internet, when I was very young, and I didn't have a party background. I was, how should I put it, someone who came in very green, very raw. And I was struck, I can't remember the date that Kluckman's volumes were published. I think they might have been late 60s. I'm not sure. Either way.
69.
Okay, exactly. Either way, when I got hold of them as a member of the Young Communist League, a very young member of the Young Communist League, he was reproducing resolutions from 1920, 1921, 1922. And I was just struck. I was just struck by, I like this stuff. What a difference it is to the Morning Star. What a difference it is to the British Road to Socialism. What a difference this is to the reformism that dominated the official CPGB and the YCL when I joined it. So I can go along with Lawrence that you had this sort of bias, which I say bias, preference. I would openly declare that if I'd been around in 1916, we can't roll the history back, but my sympathies would have been with the BSP, not least, with the Easter conference where you saw Hyman walk and all the rest of it. Nonetheless, yes, I too agree that there are too many comrades on the left that look fondly, for their own reasons that Lawrence has described, in particular at the Socialist Labour Party. I just think that's a fundamental mistake. If you want to be a syndicalist, fair enough. Of course, that will be the organisation that you look to. But I also think it's worthwhile saying that the BSP, and I know more about the BSP, I suppose, than I do about the SLP. How should I put it? Was no sect. So you can certainly say that Henry Hyman was a chauvinist. There's no doubt about that. It's worthwhile looking, though, at his line on the Boer War, for example, not because it was had anything to write home about, quite the opposite. Although he opposed it on the basis of this is Jewish money. Britain is being motivated by Jewish finance capital. What was noticeable, and you can read it in Justice, the official paper that he financed, is that in East London, you had comrades like Lawrence has already mentioned him, Theodore Rothstein, right? And a lot of others. I mean, it was a Jewish area. It was a strong area for the Social Democratic Federation, which became the BSP, protesting at what they saw as a primitive, backward form of socialism. They didn't use the phrase socialism of fools, but it was that sort of attitude. They were sort of not condescending to old Henry Hyman, but their tone wasn't aggressive. It was more sympathetic that he hadn't got over this, how should I put it, malady, this sort of backward attitude. But the point I'm really emphasizing here is they had a healthy, relatively speaking, internal life that found its expression in the press, in Justice. And I presume that would have been blocked. I'm only guessing. Lawrence, you'll have to tell me if I'm wrong. Either way, you had the launch of The Call, which was an oppositionist paper that won the day in terms of the argument and won the majority of delegates. And as I said, my understanding was that Hyman walked. I don't know with how many. I don't know how many stayed. I don't know how many were changed. Either way, compared with most of the modern left, the BSP and before it, the SDF had a relatively healthy internal life, and it found its expression externally. Should also be added that as well as getting things wrong often about those that they were closely associated with personally, Marx and Engels misjudged the SDF because of Hyman. Engels and Marx were both contemptuous of Hyman and therefore tended to be dismissive of the BSP and went for organizations that didn't last, such as the Socialist League. And of course, what I'm referring to about personal relations, comrades might find this controversial on this forum, I don't know. They dismissed Kautsky. He's a waste of time, but they both rated Bernstein much more highly. Anyway, that aside, I I think we also ought to add, perhaps, Lawrence, the sort of the difference between what the new organization was and what the old organization was. And again, that comes, how should you put it, as a mixed bag, perhaps. But some writers sort of, mourn the formation of the CPGB, because I think the official membership figures when they came to count it was something like 2,000. And if you add up what went in, it wasn't more than the sum of its parts in terms of membership. I think the BSP, for example, claimed 10,000. I take that figure myself, at the same level as the claims of the SWP having 5,000 members. I don't know what the SPEW organization claims at the moment. But the fact of the matter is that if you take these 2,000 people, they really were rooted in the working class. They were rooted in the Labour Party. They were rooted in industry. They were rooted in the communities that they lived in. They really were, part of, and I would say the leading part of the working class. And again, with all the criticisms that we ought to have of this small organization, I do think that it has got, and that was the title of this talk, it has got lessons for today. Now, we cannot magic up a February. We cannot, magic up an October revolution, unfortunately. There is no Bolshevik organization that I can detect abroad. There's nobody of a similar standing to Lenin or Luxemburg or Liebknecht around at the moment. But I do think there is a positive lesson there. And that is, although Lawrence is no doubt right, that at least you ought to put a question mark over the possibility of unification. I don't know. I do think that, if the Russian Revolution had failed, the momentum towards unity was there. And, it's worthwhile stressing, of course, that the SDF and the BSP were themselves, how should I put it, the result of unifications. So that, that was going on. And again, I'm just going to finish with this. So-called interference wasn't something that came with Lenin. That was, Lawrence has already indicated, that was considered normal. And if you look at the BSP and before that, the SDF, and one organization that hasn't been mentioned, and I'm sure Lawrence will sort of go, yeah, I should have mentioned it, is the Independent Labour Party, because one of the components, it came later, was not only people who'd left the ILP, but people who came from the left wing of the ILP. People like Palm Dutt came over. I think that would be 1921. I'm not sure of the date. But the point would be that the Socialist International was agitating in Britain for these organizations to unite. And it really was putting on pressure for them to unite in one organization. And yes, the general consensus, I would guess, was they ought to affiliate to this very strange organization that we've got in Britain called the Labour Party. Half a party, half a trade union. What the hell is it? Either way, there was, quote unquote, interference. Why the hell can't you comrades get together? You can still have your differences, but you ought to be in one party. I would say the same thing today, that of course we've got differences. And as long as someone doesn't come along and say, well, that's only for internal expression, we ought to be uniting. We ought to be struggling to unite, because one thing I'm convinced of is that the early CPGB, again, for all its faults, was far more effective than the Socialist Labour Party, the BSP, Sylvia Pankhurst Workers' Socialist Federation, and all the rest of them. It really was a leap forward. It was a qualitative development, and that is something that is achievable today, as I said, without a Lenin, without a Luxembourg, without a communist international, without a February Revolution, without an October Revolution. It's a subjective question, but it is something that we can learn from history, and it's a lesson of history which we could apply today in Britain to make what is, how should I put it, hardworking but ineffective left something qualitatively better. Anyway, I'm going to finish with that. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you, Jack. That was also fascinating, and I think we'll have a very good debate here today. Um, I was going to ask a question, but I suspect William O'Brien, who's currently in the audience, may be about to answer the question that I was going to ask. William, pleasure to see you as always. Over to you. You need to unmute, comrade.
What I am going to say is not going to be very complimentary to the British Communist Party. And I must point out that I'm an ex-member of the YCL. I was brought up in Birmingham. My father was on the national executive of the Communist Party of Great Britain during the Second World War. And I'll explain that in a minute. But the attitude of British communists towards Ireland has been absolutely appalling. We had a Communist Party set up in Ireland in 1921. And people like the writers, Liam O'Flaherty and his brother, Thomas O'Flaherty, and James Connolly's son, Rory Connolly, were among the founders of that party. They were told a lie by the General Secretary of the British Communist Party that they were to disband, that was the instruction that came down from the Comintern in Moscow. Now, in those days, communications weren't as easy as they are today. So that was taken at face value and they disbanded. It took 60 years for that lie to be exposed, or more, because how it was exposed was after the Berlin Wall came down in 69, or whenever it came down, 89, the records of the Comintern were found. And Emmett O'Connor, who is an eminent Irish historian and works in the university in Derry, and who also speaks Russian, and who comes from a communist background, his father was in the International Brigade, actually found it. And we knew then it took that long for us to be told a lie, for the lie to be disproved. Now, at the time, and none of the two previous speakers spoke about what was going on. There was a revolution in Ireland in 1916, and there was a war of independence going on from 1918, and it was going on when the British Communist Party was founded, and they didn't have a position on it. They said that it was petty nationalism and it wasn't to do with socialism. The British working class in general cannot face up to their imperialist past. They honestly believe that they taught the world their British ways. Civilized India, they used to tell me when they went to school in Birmingham. And I used to say, yeah, and the Indians had a civilization. We were still living in caves. Bullshit. And of course, that didn't get me very far with the English school teachers, I can tell you that. But in any event, that was the reason why the Irish Communist Party was not founded in 1921. It resurrected itself in 1930. And it then was going on, it was going pretty good. But the Second World War came and they had to split. They decided that they would create two communist parties, one in the occupied zone, which would be known as the Communist Party of Northern Ireland, and one in the Free State, which would be known as the Workers' Party. They were supporting the Russians after the Barbarossa. Now, before that, they didn't. Before that, they were looking for neutrality. They tell you that one of the leading lights, Betty Sinclair, was jailed for organising strikes when she wasn't. She was jailed for giving out leaflets to encourage disaffection. And that changed overnight when Barbarossa came around. Now, to get back to the First World War, the Irish delegation that went, and last week a fellow said that they met in Copenhagen. I checked it out this week. They met in Stuttgart, and all the socialist parties in Europe in 1912 took a vote that if an imperialist war was created between two imperialist powers, Germany and Britain, that they would cause a general strike in the two countries and prevent the working class from killing each other. Only two nations that voted for that, two delegations that voted for that, honoured that. One was the Russians under Lenin, and the other was the Irish. Now, Connolly didn't attend that, and neither did Larkin. A man called Carl O'Shannon led the Irish delegation on that. Now, we honoured that. The British left, got jingoistical, and started wrapping the Union Jack around them. The Union Jack that we called the Bush's apron. And they were calling it chauvinism, and it was particularly among the Labour Party. When the 1916 rising took place, it was the Labour Party that was pushing for the execution of the leaders of that rebellion. That's when it was quite clear that the Irish were fighting for their own independence and were fighting British imperialism. It was regarded as treachery and dividing the working classes between Ireland and Britain. Load of bullshit, as there was never any unity between the Irish working classes. Now, in the Second World War, after Barbarossa, the Communist parties in Northern Ireland played a very good role. And it organised in the aircraft industry and in the shipbuilding industry. And they played a role that they would keep industrial disputes to a minimum, and that any disputes that were to be dealt with by arbitration, and the arbitration must be binding. Now, the Communist Party in that occupied zone, at the end of the war, when they had the election for the storming Parliament, ended up getting 12,000 votes, which was an enormous amount of votes under a Communist Party ticket. And they would have been from what were former Unionist votes, because it was the Unionist part. And now that's ignored as well. At the moment, there's two Communist parties now, and they split. One is called the Communist Party of Ireland, the other is called the Irish Communist Party. Now, the Irish Communist Party is actually led by an Englishwoman called Linda Walker from Sheffield. Now, as far as I'm concerned, she is a jingoistic Brit. She is disgraceful. When in '69, when the civil rights movement and got off the ground, and in August '69, in the second week in August '69, when the city of Derry was being attacked by Unionist sectarian forces, the Communist Party of Great Britain was holding their annual conference, and they actually passed a resolution calling for the British Army to intervene. Now, the British Army did intervene, and they stopped the rioting. But then it wasn't very long before they turned on the rioters, and they were slaughtered and murdered. And we have the British Communist Party have never led any anti-imperialist struggle in any British colony. Now, there's a very strong Irish connection in the British Communist Party, known as the Connolly Association. And Desmond Graves, who was from his people. He was a Scouse himself from Liverpool. But both his parents were from County Antrim. They were Methodists, and he was brought from a very religious family. But he had very good politics, and he was actually the architect of the civil rights movement. It was a real reformist sort of a thing. We won't go for the national question. We'll go for the first thing is we will go for civil rights because nationalists and Catholics weren't getting houses, they weren't getting jobs, and it was blatant discrimination. And he exposed all that, and he exposed it in great detail, and that's what that led to the peaceful marches that were attacked again. And Wilson was in power at the time, the British Labour Party, and Wilson used to boast that he represented more Irish people in the British Parliament than any Irish member of Parliament represented in the Irish Parliament. And that could very well have been true, because he was the MP for Huyton in Liverpool. And in the 1918 election, an Irish nationalist was elected in Huyton, in Liverpool. So he did have a great knowledge. Wilson had a very good understanding of Ireland, but he still was an Englishman when the boy down the brass tacks, and he put in the South and the army, and the army were there for the next 30 years, murdering and slaughtering the Irish, and that's what they were doing. Now, about the anti-imperialist struggle was never discussed in the British Communist Party. You want about Sylvia Pankhurst. The excuse is given that she wouldn't hand over her magazine, the Dreadnought, to the control of the party. She wouldn't do that, but that wasn't the main reason she left. She left because they didn't have an anti-imperialist stand. Also, John Maclean, who was a Scottish communist, John Maclean was had an excellent position on the British Empire, and he wanted the independence of Scotland. He was refused entry. Now, Willie Gallagher, who was actually Irish, if the truth's known, both his parents were Irish, and both his parents landed up in Scotland, in Glasgow, not being even able to speak English when they arrived. Now, he had very, very strong Irish connections, but he still ran with the Jingoists, and that's what he done. Now, there was another man who was kindly handed over the command of the Irish Revolution to a fellow called Sean McLaughlin. Sean McLaughlin couldn't possibly join the British Communist Party because they hadn't got an anti-imperialist line. Now, when my father was in it, he was in it because at the end, during the Second World War, at the beginning of it, they set up, the British set up a contingent of Irishmen. 500 were in it, and they were exempt from conscription, but they used to have to go and do all the nasty work, and they'd be walking in among unexploded bombs on buildings ready to fall down. They were building workers, and they had to be ready to move. They had to have their bags packed every day and left at the digs. Like my father actually went on the back of a lorry from Surrey up to Warrington in the middle of winter, because that's how they had to do it. Now, he also had, it wasn't all the work, there was fun as well. He actually played cricket for Surrey, and he played rugby union for St. Helens in the 1 year. Now, that's the way the war was on. They had to make up teams, and they'd come onto the site and they'd say, anyone could play this, anyone can play that. And you'd volunteer. You always got a load of drink afterwards. And so they done all that. So now he actually then, he was one of the representatives. The man who who they put in charge was a man called Bill Scott. Now, Bill Scott was the first Irish volunteer to the International Brigade. He went from London to Paris, where he met Marshal Tito. Marshal Tito was the recruiting officer. He had lived in London, and he had mixed with the Irish a lot. He liked the Irish. He liked the way they drank, and he liked the fun they had. And he knew them. Now, Bill managed to get himself a sailor's pass from the Sailors Union, and he went to Paris. Now, the Irish had then set up their own battalion, the Connolly Column, to go to the Spanish Civil War. Then they were the Spanish put them into an English-speaking group, which was known as the Oliver Cromwell Brigade. Now, that was like a red flag to a bull as far as the Irish were concerned, the Oliver Cromwell Brigade, right? There was absolute killing between the Irish and the British brigadiers, so much so that the Irish took up guns ready to shoot them. Then the Irish found that one of the leaders of the British, a fellow called Natal, was actually an ex-Black and Tan who had murdered the Lord Mayor of Limerick. They held him, they court-martialed him, and they sentenced him to death. And they asked the Spanish for permission to shoot him, and they said no. They needed him for training. Then they found out another fellow was an ex-Black and Tan. So that gives you an idea what kind of people are on the British left. They can't move 1 inch away from the jingoistic, the chauvinism. They just cannot do it, no matter how hard they try. Now, in the end, we have now got a Communist Party in Ireland. We have two, but unfortunately, we didn't get off the ground. And the people who are to blame for that are the British, the CPGB. They're to blame for that. The Irish made a great contribution to the British working class. You only have to look at fellows like that chap that's in the Lynch, Mick Lynch. Mick Lynch, when they asked him who his hero was, he said James Connolly. And the reporter said, who? James Connolly. Oh, he said, you probably never heard of him. Well, he's my hero, right? Now, that's the kind of people that we have. And we made a major contribution, which is ignored. But you cannot face up to your own imperialist past. I'm sorry. So I don't know whether you agree with all that. You probably don't.
Thank you, William. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. Comrades, William has had the floor. No one else has put their hands up. The question I wanted to ask was actually rather simpler, which was given the changes that took place with chauvinists being walking or moving out of the organisations that went to form on the CPGB was in 1916. What was the impact of the Easter Uprising? Comrades, Ant, over to you. You need to unmute yourself, comrade.
Right. Yes.
Yes, sir, I can hear you.
Yes. I've got the video, everything's all there. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I suppose much of what I've got to say is around the topic. I'm not sure if I'm directly. Well, yeah, I think it's directly relevant actually. I think the whole problem was, the whole issue here is well, essentially it's the failure of the world revolution. So looking at 1920, 1921, I think that's the point in time whereby what I would say with the counter revolution began. So I'm going to say that Lenin was a revolutionary. Lenin made an enormous contribution. His opposition to the imperialist war, the April Theses, swinging the party behind revolution. But no one could overcome the issue of an isolated revolution in a backwards area. And I think essentially there were only two options when you distill it all down, and the two options were admission of defeat, which I think would have been the better option myself. I think admission of defeat would have been the better option. The other option is what actually transpired, and Lenin went over to the capitalist camp. he didn't realize it. He saw it all as it was all a question, a process, grasping at straws. But I think at the end he did recognize what was happening, but he was almost on his deathbed, and by that time it was too late. And I would say that as regard the CPGB, well, the problem being is that Lenin's influence or was entirely, it wasn't helpful. It wasn't helpful. All these ideas of iron discipline and suppression of factions, and you must join the Labour. I think let's just say this. This thing in favour of Lenin. Obviously, I have emphasised it before. He made an enormous revolutionary contribution, no doubt about it. But Lenin did not see the Labour Party as being something positive for the working class. Lenin did not think that the participation in the Labour Party or the election of a Labour Party was something good for the working class. He merely saw that it would serve to expose the real nature of the Labour Party if it was helped into power. So he talked about supporting the Labour Party the way that in the manner of a rope supporting a hanged man. There was nothing positive about, there's no illusion that the Labour Party could solve the problems of the working class, which I think is far from the positions of most what I call the capitalist left today. But I would say myself that the whole orientation towards social democracy, the whole process which went on in the Soviet in Russia was an attempt to find a way to live with capitalism in a situation whereby the revolutionary wave has subsided. So I would say that the two trends that were present at the outset, at the beginning of the Communist Party of Great Britain, the two trends of the two, I would say that the left, for all its mistakes, for all it was flawed. I think that Lenin was correct to say that we should participate in trade unions. I'm not sure about the participation in elections, but I would say that's not a question of principle. It's simply extremely difficult for us to use them. If it could be used, I'm not standing against using Parliament on principle at all. But I would say that of the two trends that are present, the right wing is far more dangerous to the working class than the left wing, and I think that the idea that the first speaker talked about going a little bit beyond the initial creation of the Communist Party of Great Britain, but it seems to be talking about the zenith of the CPGB being the Popular Front and Peace. To me that was absolutely.
No, just heckle. I didn't actually say that. Do you want to listen?
Sorry.
Get a hearing aid. I didn't actually say that. I said the CPGB, later CPGB, treated it as the zenith.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Get a hearing aid.
Okay. But I'm going to say that the defeat of the German Revolution was also the defeat of the Russian Revolution, and that all of Lenin's tactics and all of his attempts to use the system, against itself, could not overcome that reality, and that the problem was that all that was left was for the construction of capitalism. No, it wasn't the
Right.
it wasn't the classical capitalism that existed before 1917, but everything that Stalinism created was built on a foundation that Lenin had provided, and I think that the proof of all of this, the proof of all of this is the actual historic record. The revolution was defeated. The same party and the whole international, so that's including the Communist Party of Great Britain. So all of the organization
And
was transformed into a vast counter-revolutionary apparatus that murdered communists and workers. And it created, subservience of the working class to capitalists in the colonial, semi-colonial countries, and illusions in the capitalist left wing.
right, thank you.
Okay.
Let's just stop you there.
Yeah.
You can come back. I'm not.
No, you're okay.
I'm not stifling your contribution, but I do want to get some response from first Lawrence and then Jack, because there's been an awful lot of content in there. I would urge comrades to put their hands up and make other contributions, ask questions. Lawrence, over to you.
Okay, well, I think both of the contributions so far have been a bit, well, I spoke about the dangers of. I just want to make it clear that I don't think the comrades seem to be even aware that they're listening to. We're talking about the formation of the CPGB in the 1920. We're talking about this very early period, and we're being given quite long, kind of copious lectures. Looking, what I warned about is looking through the wrong end of the telescope. We all know what happened to the Communist International. We actually know that the CPGB, as it developed through into the 30s, 40s, 50s, we know that it was a fairly rotten organization. We're not suggesting that. We're looking at the early CPGB that was formed in 1920 and 21. We're not talking about, we do understand. And if you want horror stories about the CPGB as it became, I mean, I can certainly give you a few, and Jack will certainly give you plenty of it because he had plenty of experience of it because he was a member of it in the 60s, late 60s and 70s and 80s. So horror stories don't shock us. None of that kind of surprises us, but that's not really what this talk was about. We're actually looking at the early foundation years of the CPGB. And so if therefore when William starts up and says, well, the CPGB had a rotten imperialist kind of line on Ireland in the 1960s. Well, I know that that was the case, but the early CPGB, I've got in front of me, I've got a CPG pamphlet called The Irish Crisis, which was from 1921, pamphlet by, and in that pamphlet, the early CPGB, it's a good pamphlet and it discusses their support for the Republican movement. But the headline quote from it is the Communist Party of Great Britain hails the dauntless fight of the Irish Republicans in their successful struggle against the British government. So the evidence really is something else to what comrades actually want to look at. Secondly, on ants kind of stuff. Well, I don't actually know who he's been listening to, and it just to me it just seems like Ant, you just seem to be coming out with a stream of jargon. I don't know where I said in my opening talk that where I said the Labour Party will solve everybody's problems. I don't know who said that in the CPGB in the early 1920s. I mean, I just don't, I don't actually know who you're listening to on that type of thing. And then the other stuff you're talking about the collapse of the world revolution. Again, you're looking through this at the wrong end of the telescope. We're looking at the CPGB in its initial kind of foundation kind of years. The kind of collapse of the Russian Revolution and the changes that took place, excuse me, the changes that took place in Russian society under Stalin in the late 20s, that's still kind of to come. Now, I'm sure that you can look at antecedents and things that didn't look quite right about the early CPGB, but you really need to be careful that we're not talking about, this is not a Stalinized kind of organization. This is not, it's not that at all. So it's very difficult for me to kind of deal with either William or Ant really, because I just think you're both looking through the wrong end of the telescope, and this is precisely the type of uh, a methodology that I would say is kind of wrong. You've actually got to look at the CPGB, the early CPGB, in its historical context as it was at the time. It's very easy for me to it's very easy for people to just to say, well, yeah, it's done this at one point, so therefore I don't like any of it. But I think that that's kind of wrong. Things change over time. It's a kind of elementary point of Marxism. The CPGB's line on Ireland obviously deteriorated, right? And it wasn't, and by the time it came to the 1980s, 70s, and 80s, they certainly did not support the Irish Republicans. That's true, but that's not a problem of the CPGB in 1920 and 1921. Going back to the stuff that kind of uh, John was quite right to kind of Jack is quite right to pick me up on one thing. I didn't really have time to go into it, but the unity process around the early CPGB was something that had been begun, that something had begun. It was begun by the Second International, and there was lots of moves to by the Second International before the First World War to push the ILP, to push the BSP into being within the same organization, and that is actually how the BSP ended up affiliating to the Labour Party in 1916. This was something that had already been set in train before the war, at the prompting of the Second International. And the interesting thing about the BSP affiliated to the Labour Party in 1916 is, as I've read the reports from the time, it was completely uncontroversial. There's no kind of problem with it, because obviously the Labour Party at that point still saw itself as having a kind of a federal kind of organisation. And as I say, this was something that had been shelved by the war anyway, so it didn't cause any great debate. There was some grumbling from some Labour Party members about BSP coming in and advocating revolutionary politics, but they were very much in the minority. So yes, is a process that had been set in train, and so it's perfectly possible that if there'd have been no Russian Revolution, that these organizations would have carried on this path of kind of unity. I just think that a lot of impetus seemed to come from the Russian Revolution and the Comintern towards founding the CPGB. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Lawrence. I'll get a response from Jack, if that's okay, and then Owen has got his hand up, and so has Paul Fleurs, and so I'll bring them in after Jack's response.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I mean, just in terms of Ant, I mean, I'll be very quick, but you might as well take the position that given where we are, it was all Charlie Marx's fault, or if you wanted to go back further, the French Revolution, it's to blame for Stalin. I don't know how far back you want to go. Okay, fair enough. But I mean, my own take on the Soviet Union, I find it very hard to describe it as capitalism, but this is a separate debate, as is the CPGB and Ireland. I mean, I was asked to speak on the foundation of the CPGB. So we've been given a tour through the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, I don't know, the present situation in Ireland, all fascinating stuff. I don't know. I don't know whether it is. Anyway, I don't really think I've got anything else to say, Ian, to tell the truth.
Okay, Owen, over to you.
Hiya. Yeah, thanks for this. I'm in sympathy, I think, with what Lawrence was saying, but I guess and in particular, I think I agree that it's important to use the conversation to emphasize the importance of the formation of the CPGB. It was obviously a massive step forward for the revolutionary forces in Britain. And I think that's presumably why it's helpful for us to have these kinds of detailed conversations about it. That said, I do think there is something to be said about kind of social chauvinism in that process. I think the challenge of the formation of the CPGB in its early years was the forging of a properly communist organization out of the imperfect material that existed in the British Labour movement at the time. And it seems to me that an important part of that process was precisely the ironing out of chauvinistic ideas, which even affected some of the more heroic figures in the British Labour movement at the time. So, like, I've been reading recently around the Red Clydeside movement, and 1919 was obviously an important year for Labour militancy in Britain and elsewhere, but it was also a massive year for racial violence that also occurred at Clydeside and was championed by, and was even led by figures in the Seamen's Union. And Willie Gallagher was actually kind of implicated in the effort to direct some of the workers' anger at black and Chinese seamen who were taking lower wages. And the effort then to forge out of those very good militant trade union leaders who nevertheless had these kind of nationalist and racial prejudices, to forge out of them like a revolutionary and communist party, that's an important contribution of the early Communist Party and a challenge for it. And it seems to me that this is precisely why I think Lawrence is right to emphasize the important role, the constructive role that the International was the International was playing, and the Russian section played in pushing some of the early communist parties, not just in Britain. I know a similar process went on in the US, pushing them toward reckoning with precisely that problem of social chauvinism. And so that kind of draws me toward a bit of a question, I guess, for the speakers, which is, well, actually, I guess I have a few questions. One of them is about whether the important role that the International was playing at that time indicates to us that there is something to be said for what I think of as usually the Trotskyist argument, that any revolutionary organization needs to start as the organization of an international revolutionary party whose national sections are subordinated to that international center. It seems to me that there is actually quite a good argument for that, and precisely the experience of the British Communist Party seems to me to be a good case study for why it's important to have the international standpoint as the international organization as a starting point for national sections. So I wonder if there's something to be said for that kind of classic Trotskyist form of organization, seeking to, I guess, replicate the importance of the Comintern to that movement. And I guess on a slightly different but related note, I'd ask what you see as the relevancy for the contemporary moment is from the formation of the CPGB. Is there a precise analogy to be made between the attempts to forge unity from the BSP and these other groups into a communist party? Do you think that the present proliferation of sects is that an analogous situation? Would that unification forge a more robust organization than the CPGB proved to be? Yeah, I'm wondering about what the analogies are that you're trying to draw.
Thank you, Owen. Paul, are you still there?
Yeah.
Here we go.
Just old Walter Kendall, who's mentioned earlier on by Lawrence. He's not a Trotskyist. He's was a Kautskian, a lifelong one, and he felt that the establishment of the Comintern basically enforced a template upon working class organisations, irrespective of the conditions pertaining in the country, conditions which pertaining in the young Soviet Republic at the time. This is 1920 with the 21 conditions. And this basically hamstrung the left from being able to unite in the respect of the conditions within each country, and basically there would be a division. He recognised there was a division within the working class institutions between those who supported the war and basically were pro-capitalist, and a left which would be much broader than what actually ended up in the communist parties themselves. Now, I don't accept everything that Walter said. In fact, I'm very critical of Walter's position in a lot of ways, but I think that he raised some interesting arguments. I'm putting together at the moment, I'm going through the proofs of the reissue of his revolutionary movement in Britain. It's going to be a real Haymarket job. So 18 months' time, there'll be an inexpensive paperback of it. But also, there was the subordination, Walter sees it, of communist parties to the Soviet Republic, because he puts it perhaps a bit crudely in the sense of financial control, that the whole formation of the party in Britain, and by extension other parties, was very much over-influenced by resources which Moscow could provide. Again, I think he overstates the point, but I think there is something there. It's interesting that Walter, as a Kautsky, would probably agree with what Ant was saying about the influence of Moscow's foreign policy, its diplomacy over the communist parties. So we get sort of, a left communist agreeing with Kautskians here, which I think is an interesting alignment, let's say. But I think, again, there's some truth in that, although it's wrong to see the process as solidified from the start, which I think Walter did in his book. The other thing was Walter made was the question which William raised earlier, which is of John Maclean, because Maclean was a member of the British Socialist Party. He was on the left of it, and he was probably the closest to having a revolutionary stance on the war as opposed to a pacifist stance on the left in Britain. And he never joined the Communist Party. He thought it was a rotten bloc. He wrote to Lenin an open letter, which is easily available on the internet, where he felt that the Communist Party in Britain, as it evolved, as it emerged, had was pretty much a rotten block of various opportunists and others. Again, I think here, this is something which you should look at, because if anyone was a revolutionary leader in Britain at the time, it was Maclean. Now, and also the way that the people like Gallagher and others dealt with it was by saying, well, he'd gone off his rocker. He was losing his marbles. He was going insane. I mean, this is a completely apolitical and quite unpleasant way of dealing with someone raising serious political questions. Now, again, I would dispute that having a Scottish Communist Party, and that was a way forward. But nevertheless, Maclean didn't come into the Communist Party. There was also a lot of other people, and this comes out through the mentioned in Walter's book, although he doesn't actually follow it up because it only goes up to 1921. There was a lot of people who were moving leftwards during the First World War in the BSP, and they kind of just disappeared. When the bulk of the party joined the Communist Party, these people sort of just faded from viewpoint. Another point which Walter's book makes, which again he doesn't really develop the argument, but I think it's something we ought to look at, was that the shop stewards movement, which again was very strong on Clydeside, but also strong in the engineering centres of Yorkshire, Lancashire, and so forth, and also in the south in London and places. So, was that they didn't challenge the union bureaucracies. They didn't attempt to challenge them politically or organisationally. They also ignored an awful lot of political questions. And a lot of the people who were leaders of this shop stewards movement ended up with BSPers and ended up in the Communist Party. But they dodged the issue of the war. They didn't connect the question of fighting for terms and conditions in respect of the opposition to the First World War. Maclean did, and that was to Maclean's great merit. I'll leave it at that, but I'm saying that a lot of the questions that come up in Walter Kendall's book, although I disagree with, and I think everyone here would disagree with a lot of his conclusions, does raise an awful lot of questions about both the strengths and weaknesses of the left, the question of how positive or the negative sides of Moscow's intervention, and looking at afresh at a very important and very interesting period in the history of the left in Britain.
Thank you, Paul. Minnie, and then I'll ask Jack to come back for a response.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, comrades. Thanks to Lawrence and Jack for the talks. They're really interesting. And I'll try and stick to, the subject, but a series of questions, really. My questions are, just got my scribble notes here. Yeah, what was the program of the CPGB around the, 1921 or, whatever the period you're talking about? What's the flavour of the propaganda they were putting out to the working class? And I know you say, obviously, organisations fused. That's inspiring to hear. And so inspiring to hear about the leaders that were around at that time. The calibre of the leaders, which we don't seem to have now. So a flavour of the propaganda. And did the party attract a lot of, individual members of the working class to join, members of the public just to come on board and join? And also I want to ask, what was the democratic structure within the CPGB at the time? I know there was like some fused organisations. Was it the BSP, the SLP, the Sylvia Paggers group? Was it the ILP? Others, I'm not sure. But what did they keep their identities? It sounds like they kept their identities within the CPGB. Was it a kind of umbrella with these other organisations coming in? And did those organisations keep their democratic structures with their leaders within that? Or was it kind of Russian doll thing with democracies within a democracy? And what was the actual democratic structure? Just sorry, too many questions, but and then And then obviously maybe the next talk, I'd like to hear what happened, next and the further history of it. It's really interesting. Thank you, comrades.
Jack, do you want to come back first? Did you want to, or do you want Lawrence to come back?
Yeah, I'll do that. And then I think that was our agreement at the beginning. I'm not worried, but I've got no fuss. But yeah, okay. Right. Hold on. Okay, begin with Owen. Look, I don't know what Willie Gallagher did in 1919, but personally, I don't really buy into the idea that he was someone encouraging a anti-migrant riot. Now, I can't prove that, but I'm just saying I doubt it. It's a bit like the story of, I don't know how it happened, of what's his name? You'll remember, Lawrence, Jack Dash, sort of leading workers out. This sort of comes down to you in favor of Enoch Powell. Well, just these things get told, but it's, I can assure you, not true. So anyway, I just express skepticism, and there you are. But yes, in terms of, I think your basic thrust, Owen, is anti-imperialism and taking a principled position. My own take on it is that with all sorts of criticisms that you can make, they were anti-imperialist. I just think that to claim otherwise is to produce a sort of, I don't know, a nationalist caricature. There's plenty of stuff to be criticized, but nonetheless, they were against the British Empire. They were against the colonial oppression. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I mean, they ran, what was it called, Hands Off Ireland. I think the CPGB actually also is engaged in gun running. But anyway, I sort of shrug my shoulders really on that and go, well, that's sort of what you would expect. But the main point that you're making, I think, Owen, here, at least I want to take up, I think you are fundamentally mistaken. And that is, we have to have an international. Well, looking at the Trotskyists, I would say that the last thing we want is anything like that. I mean, we call them, at least in, I was responsible for the phrase, but oil slick internationals. I just think are a complete waste of time, let alone when you use the word, the subordination of local groups to some international. I mean, we've seen it with Jerry Healy, Tony Cliff, Alex Kalinikos, Peter Taff. If that's your model, then God help us. And I would emphasize that in terms of the first international, that was a real international. Again, it's no model. We can't reproduce it, but that didn't subordinate, right? It coordinated, and it coordinated real organizations. And I'd say the same thing with the second international. And again, we can criticize it, until the cows come home. But it was a real international because it was made up of real organizations. And of course, it couldn't, and it didn't subordinate. So it was urging the ILP, which was an affiliate, it was urging the SDF to join together. It couldn't issue an instruction. Now, when we come to the third international, I think what we need to learn there is the sort of thing that Lawrence was on about. We can criticize it, but to criticize it on the basis of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, I think misses the point. What we need to understand is precisely what they thought about the time that they were living in. And they thought they were facing imminent civil war. They thought there was a global revolution that had begun, you could argue 1916, you could certainly argue 1917. And that's where you get this whole question of military discipline, how military it was in reality. I'm somewhat skeptical of. But yes, Minnie, you asked the question about democracy and all the rest of it. No, in terms of public expression, you didn't have full, but you did have some. And certainly compare, and that's the official Communist Party, throughout its entire history, including the stinking corpse that I joined, was far more open, far more democratic than SPEW, SWP, RCP, you name it. I mean, I wrote publicly about a dozen different contributions for various comrades in the CPGB. We reproduced the Leninist that was published by the official CPGB in the pre-Congress period. Anyway, so we need to understand what this organization was. And in terms of Owen, you say, is there any, I mean, I did note your words, Dan, is there any direct analogy? No, no, precisely. We're not in the middle of World War I. We haven't had anything like the Russian Revolution. We need to understand, how should I put it, the depth of socialist education in Europe and beyond that existed in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. We're living in hellish times, in comparison, famished times. So no, there's no direct analogy, but there are lessons to be learned, in my opinion. And that is that we can overcome disunity. The question is how? I'm not waiting for Lenin. I'm not waiting for the Russian Revolution. I'm not waiting to, how should I put it, universalize civil war Bolshevism. I think that would be a fundamental mistake that we see played out in miniature on the left today. No, but there are still lessons to be learned. That's what I would argue. And in terms of Paul, I haven't read. I mean, Lawrence, you're going to have to fill me in on Walter Kendall's. I haven't got him on my bookshelf. I don't know. But if he was arguing that, look, this is a bit artificial, there would be a truth there. But that's, to me, that again, I haven't read his book, and so I don't want to put words in his mouth. But yes, there would be a truth there. That if we look at what the Communist Party expected, the period that Lenin was expecting, the Communist International was expecting, if they'd known what was going to happen, I would hope they would do it differently. But that applies to all of us, surely, if we've got brains. You know, things don't turn out to be as you expected. You can't rerun history, but hey, let's try at least to learn some lessons. And again, I don't know, but I would go along with you, Paul. There was easy money in the CPGB, Moscow gold, to use a phrase. Whether that was determinate, I'm skeptical I'm skeptical about. But again, that's something that we should investigate concretely. My own feeling is that having, the world revolution having failed, you had, from their point of view, one place where it succeeded, and they appeared to be the authority, and they got used to bowing to that authority. They got used to not thinking for themselves. And we, if we want to learn a lesson, I think it's learn to think. Don't just repeat tired formulas, learn to think. And if we can start to learn to think, then at least there's hope. If we don't learn to think, then our situation is hopeless. With that happy thought, Ian.
Is what I regard as a magnificently optimistic thought. Thank you very much. We're coming up to nearly 2 hours, so I'm going to ask Lawrence to summarize, if you would, please.
Okay. I'm just going to answer a few people. I was interested in Owen's questions, but I think John's kind of told you much of what I think about it. Contrary to what you might read elsewhere, me and John do agree. Me and Jack do agree on quite a lot. And particularly on these issues. But one thing, though, Owen, really is that I do have experience of what Jack was talking about in the old oil slick international type of thing. for my sins in the early 90s, I was a candidate member of a Trotskyist organization called Workers' Power. And I remember going to a meeting of its, and it was a meeting with all the international comrades. It wasn't a very big room, let me tell you that for a start off. But also, what I actually found, I was expecting to go and meet international, like for example, as it is at the moment, we have quite a good relationship in Britain with the Marxist Unity Group comrades and the comrades around Cosmonaut and all that type of stuff. And generally, it's a good relationship. And there is some genuine kind of diversity, like of different experiences, because we're not an oil slick international. When I was in Workers' Power, I don't want to denigrate any of the people who are the so-called international members of the Workers' Power tendency. I don't want to denigrate them as people or comrades, but they were just like they were just cutouts and copies of like Richard Brenner and the other British comrades who were the leading comrades. They just parroted, and it's kind of obvious when you kind of see that this is not an international. If you compare that to what happened when the Comintern was founded, when you look at you look at the debates and even what we've talked about, Lenin taken aside Gallagher and Sylvia Pankhurst, people who had big difference with him tactically, and you have this kind of debate and this kind of, and you look at the sometimes angry way in which the early Comintern and the heckles and the interventions. This was a live, a real thing that was been formed as a result of war and revolution. When you kind of meet these kind of members of Trotskyist oil slick internationals, whatever their merits as individuals, this is not an international. There's no diversity there. It's just the people in the other countries parrot what the mothership in Britain or wherever else the mothership is does. And actually, I think that's a negative. Actually, I think that prejudices people against internationalism, if that's what you mean by it. Um, uh, many many ask like some well, it's quite complicated questions. There was like in terms of the program of the early CPGB, all I've ever found is the document called I think it's called something like a CPGB program draft program that they produced for the Comintern in 1924, and the flavour of it really is, in a sense, it's a long time since I've read it, but it repeats kind of, it emphasises principles like we believe in the Soviet road to revolution rather than a parliamentary road. But that was only a draft program, and Jack is more of an expert on this than I am. But I think the first CPGB program wasn't the formal CPGB program wasn't until maybe 1929. There was a class against class electoral, but that was more of an electoral kind of program from my memory. And then in 1935, there was for Soviet Britain. But there wasn't, other than aspirations and promises that they were going to write a program, I thought the early CPGB, from my memory of it, was relatively undeveloped. In terms of like what Minnie asked about the organization of the early CPGB, yes, there was this thing that Jack's already talked about militarization. There's this kind of sense, or there at least there was an aspiration towards militarization, and there was lots of chatter in early CPGB, the early years of the CPGBs, about buying guns, about militia, about arms, that actually the Comintern got quite fed up with after a while. But there was this kind of aspiration towards a militarized organization. But the contradiction of the early CPGB was that actually it ran along kind of federal kind of lines, in a sense in which the old factions that had come together to join it kind of persisted, like a long time after the early CPG was founded. So you tended to have BSP members doing their work in the Labour Party, and ex-SLP and Communist Unity Group members doing their work in the factories or whatever. So there was that type of there was that quite dynamic, and there was a now famous meeting of the Comintern in 1923 to sort out all these problems that they that they found in the British organisation, and one of the complaints was, well, everybody's just sticking to their old factional kind of allegiances. However, in those early years, we ought to express as well that there was even though people worked along those old factional lines, there was never any kind of serious kind of splitting or that type of thing going on. And there was some open debate in CPGB journals, but there wasn't an awful lot. It tended to be in more journals aimed at the party kind of cognoscenti, like Communist Review and that's kind of thing. Although even all the early CPGB publications, they all had letters columns in, and they all relied upon workers' correspondence. So it's not like you would see in a trot paper now, where you don't get any letters and you just get a kind of unified kind of line. Finally, Paul is quite right to pick me up. Walter Kendall was not a Trotskyist, and I'd misread my notes, and I said Walter Kendall is somebody who's been very influential on Trotskyists. What I meant by that was Walter Kendall. He wrote the book that Paul's talking about, the revolutionary movement in Britain, I think it's called. It tended to be popular amongst people who were very skeptical about the CPGB for all of its kind of history. Refuseniks, if you like, of the CPGB's history. And I think Paul's quite right, because things like the 21 conditions were a problem. 21 conditions, which are effectively the Comintern's 21 conditions, which is by what all parties were admitted to the Comintern on. That doesn't allow for factional viewpoints inside it, and the emphasis within it is on a kind of militarized kind of discipline. And even Lenin, of course, said that the theses were too kind of Russian. That was the kind of problem. So I'm well aware of all the contradictions around it. The problem I have with Walter Kendall really is that I do think in terms of he does look through the wrong end of the telescope, and he equates what happened later on with Stalin's rise to power and the bureaucratization of the Comintern, and he runs a straight line back from that to the early CPGB. I actually think that's kind of wrong. I actually think we can discuss, yes, the Soviet influence on the early CPG wasn't all positive. There was too much easy money kind of knocking around. And that there are problems in that if you have one party has the prestige of winning and leading a revolution, and the rest of them are all kind of parties that haven't led a successful revolution. There's that kind of problem. But you can throw the baby out with the kind of bathwater, and it's actually this opinion of mine's not very popular, but I think the Comintern actually, in general terms, gave the CPGB decent advice right up until about 1928. I mean, don't forget, it was the Comintern that told the early young CPGB, do not fold up the national left-wing movement in 1928. And it was actually the vote of CPGB members who voted to fold that organisation. So obviously, after the third period, the advice of the Comintern became severely flawed, and I wouldn't discount that. But it's the wrong end. It's just looking through things at the wrong end of the telescope. And finally, John McClain and other people, and Paul quite rightly points out that many of the BSPs or whoever joined the early CPGB drifted away. Well, for a start off, with people like McLean and the people who drifted away, we are talking about a process of fusions and splits. Sometimes, as the results of unity processes, some people are going to fall away. That's inevitably that's going to be the case. Not everybody is going to last the pace. If we were to form a communist party in Britain tomorrow, there will be some people who wouldn't join, and there were some people who wouldn't like it and flop out of the kind of process. I think that's kind of inevitable, and I don't foresee that being any other way. There are people, there'll be lots of sectarians. We're not going to cure the British left of far left of sectarianism just in a matter of months. That's going to be a much longer type of process. People will leave and people will stand from the sidelines and be sectarian towards it. And unfortunately, that's actually what I see with McLean. He formed his own little organisation, and I think the problem with making as Walter Kendall, I think, does, is in making Saint John Maclean and canonising someone who actually stood outside of the CPGB and actually couldn't join it for whatever reason, couldn't get on with them, had to do that. I think the problem with canonising those people is precisely the problem I raised at the beginning. You kind of you don't focus on the unity, you don't focus on what's actually been formed, you don't focus on anything positive. You just pick somebody who, and lots of comrades in Scotland have picked up on the legacy of John Maclean because they think it gives them an arrow to fire in favour of Scottish nationalism. The idea that Maclean formed that a communist party that was limited to Scotland. That's why that's been kind of picked on. But it's the same problem, picking individuals or groups, but not looking at the process as a whole. And it really is an issue of being unable to see the wood for the trees. And finally, yes, there's no direct analogy that we can make between the CPGB and today's situation, because we don't live in times of war and revolution. Well, we don't have individuals like Lenin. We don't even have some of the leaders around in the early CPGB. But what we can, I can say is, I think what we can see is when the CPGB was formed, it had a huge influence on the British working class and the course of the class struggle in Britain, for good or for ill, from its 1920 foundation. And the influence of the CPGB and the problems of the CPGB percolated through the British working class movement right and through until the 1980s miners' strike, when many of the miners' leaders were or had been Communist Party members, and their politics were reflections of the CPGB's kind of politics. Mick McGaughey, Scargill had been in the YCL, and his father had been a CPGB. This is an organisation that had a huge impact. There was still, even in a slightly dilapidated state of individuals and charismatic leaders, was still leading sections of the working class in the 1970s, in place of strife and all that type of stuff. Now, no one's trying to paint a very romantic picture of what the CPGB was in the 1970s, because it was awful. But what we see from that early fusion process, and a party that was genuinely linked to an actual process of war and revolution, and that had been able to join its forces, its influence, and we still today, the Communist Party still influences. Look at Jeremy Corbyn. Where did Jeremy Corbyn's politics come from? Jeremy Corbyn's politics came from a version of the CPGB's British Road to Socialism. That's what his strategy was based around. But what I'm saying to this, if we could, it would certainly be a massive step forward if we were able to join significant parts of the far left sects that exist at the moment. If we built a force of 2,000, that would have an impact upon the British working class far beyond anything that we can achieve in our piffling kinds of ones and twos. I'll shut up because I've gone on too long.
In my opinion, not nearly enough. I mean, I've personally found both contributions absolutely excellent, as well as those from the floor. the aim of Why Marx, along with the CPGB, talking about socialism from a Marxist point of view, and Prometheus, is to learn from our history, to patiently discover what we need to know to build a mass communist party for the future. And so, comrades, we will continue this next week, where I think we are looking at the Communist Party of Great Britain and the general strike. And also, let's remember that there is the Communist University taking place in central London from the 31st of July to the 7th of August for anyone who wish to join us for the whole period or for parts of it. And otherwise, I look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you very much, comrades. Thank you. Good and